Good morning, world history heads. This lesson is going to take us to the end of World War I. If you have access to your TCI history textbook, you can get this content from pages 273 to pages 275, chapter 19, World War I in your textbook. So we're going to get to the end, and here we go. Maybe. The tide turns. Within weeks of going to war in 1914, the British began a naval blockade of Germany to cut off its overseas trade. Great Britain declared the entire North Sea a war zone where British warships could stop merchant ships and seize any cargoes bound for Germany. In February 1915, Germany responded by establishing a blockade of Britain. The German Navy was still no match for the British Navy, so Germany turned to a new technology, the submarine, or U-boat. Unlike warships that operate on the surface, submarines are not equipped to capture ships or seize their cargoes. Instead, Germany enforced its blockade by announcing that its U-boats would, without warning, torpedo and sink Allied and other merchant ships approaching Great Britain. This policy eventually brought the United States into the war. I will cover that a little bit more later. I have a picture from inside these U-boats. Imagine really just having to live and operate and be underwater for days on end, essentially next to what is a gigantic engine. These U-boats were primitive, and the experiences on board U-boats were generally terrible, and even more terrifying is if you were sunk in them. You are in a pitch black room, sinking in a metal prison to the bottom of the sea. So the United States and World War I. When war broke out in Europe, the United States remained neutral. Although the nation had close historical and cultural ties with Great Britain, it had a large German-American population too. In addition, most Americans were not eager to get involved in what they viewed as a European dispute. Many American companies also saw the war as an opportunity to sell supplies to both sides. So a couple things there. One is that this is a time period where American identity is still really very new in the early 1900s. America has only been around for about 3-4 generations, and a lot of people who immigrated even earlier than that to America were from places like Germany and Ireland. And so when there are two sides, one of them being Germany, there are lots of German Americans who recently immigrated who have strong ties and support for Germany. And then there are Americans on the other side that support the British, who a lot of people identify more with that side from the long arc of American history. But maybe most importantly is this idea that at the beginning of the war, American companies can sell arms, ammunition, food supplies to both sides of the war and make double the money. And so there are some big motivations to keep the United States out of the conflict directly, but commercially very successful. Tensions with Britain increased when British warships seized American goods bound for Germany. However, the German blockade of Britain had more serious consequences. In May 1915, a U-boat sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, which was also carrying 173 tons of ammunition from New York to London. More than 1,000 passengers, including 128 Americans, lost their lives. Public outrage combined with the sinking of 2 more passenger ships later that year brought U.S.-German relations to the breaking point. To avoid war, Germany promised that its U-boats would warn merchant ships before sinking them to give those on board time to launch lifeboats. So a couple things here is that yes, the Lusitania is supposed to just be a passenger ship. However, the Germans long suspected that the Americans and the British were using these civilians as essentially shields to then smuggle arms and ammunition for the war effort. Well, Germany is stuck in a rock and a hard place here because the Americans and the British are using this to support the war effort against Germany. And then if Germany sinks passenger ships, they are going to kill innocent people. Well, as time goes on, the war gets more and more desperate. Germany using their submarines, sinks this particular U-boat, which was indeed carrying arms and ammunitions, despite the Americans and the Brits denying that. And 128 Americans are killed. Now, the way it's supposed to work with the rules of warfare is that if a merchant ship or a commercial ship is captured, the captain is supposed to let the innocent people evacuate and then sink the ship when it is empty. However, with German submarines, they are a little nice piece of technology, but there is no way for a German submarine to take care of and transport, 1,000 people. And so um, Germany undertakes this policy to sink these ships. Germany, after these big incidents, in which in places like the United States, when 128 Americans are killed on the Lusitania, the public sentiment in America starts to turn on the Germans. The Germans become a target of this idea that, well, Americans want to be able to travel the world freely, and Germany becomes the poster boy of the evil power preventing Americans from doing that and from the free trade of nations. Okay, so by late 1916, however, German leaders had become concerned about how much longer Germany could continue to fight. They decided to tighten their blockade, gambling that this would force Britain to surrender before the United States could enter the war. In February 1917, Germany resumed its previous policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. That is that policy where you do not give people the opportunity to abandon ship. Instead, you sink the ship and kill everybody on board, presumably. Now, the big event that really turns the tide against Germany from an American perspective is that in late 1917, excuse me, Germany made an offer of an alliance with Mexico. It promised that if Mexico went to war against the United States, Germany would reward Mexico with lands in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. So this is kind of the big trigger event that uh, launches the United States into World War One. Is that the United States Intelligence Service, intercepts something called the Zimmermann Telegram. And the Zimmermann Telegram was a message from the German ambassador to Mexico promising to give Mexico back territory they had lost in the Spanish-American War. Wait, the Mexican-American War. Mexican-American War. Forgive me, please. These actions. So, of course, if when Germany promises to give Mexico back huge chunks of the United States can no longer tolerate Germany, right? Americans have been killed innocently. There's harming the American economy, and this is what we call it, a casus belli, or a cause for war. The United States declares war on Germany, April 4th, 1917. You also get a moment that you don't see much more in American history, where President Woodrow Wilson goes before Congress on April 2nd to ask for the declaration of war, and then Congress declares war on April 4th, 1917 against Germany. The United States' entry into World War I was the turning point of the war. Like Germany and Austria-Hungary, Britain and France were nearly exhausted by 1917. It took nearly a year for the United States to raise and train troops and to fight in Europe. But the flow of arms, food, and other supplies to Britain and France greatly increased immediately by July 1917. U.S. warships were helping the British Navy combat the German U-boat blockade. I've recently read, I'll continue in a second here, I have a great book by Erik Larson. It's called Dead Wake, which is about the sinking of the Lusitania. I would highly suggest reading this book. It gives a perspective of several people who were on board the Lusitania, and it's really an excellent book. Erik Larson generally writes some pretty accessible and great books, but I looked up a passage here for you. It is about the moment the ship was struck. Here we go. The ship was sinking with unbelievable rapidity. There was a terrific panic on her deck. Overcrowded lifeboats, fairly torn from their positions, dropped into the water. Desperate people ran helplessly up and down the decks. Men and women jumped into the water and tried to swim to empty, overturned lifeboats. It was the most terrible sight I had ever seen. One of the legacies of the United States involvement in World War I are the 14 points. The United States also took the lead in trying to bring the war to an early end. In January 1918, President Woodrow Wilson issued a statement of war goals called the 14 Points. The first 5 points address general world concerns: an end to secret agreements between nations, freedom of the seas, the removal of trade barriers, arms reduction, and a fair settlement of colonial disputes. The next 8 points dealt with specific territorial issues in Europe and the Ottoman Empire. They were based on the principle of self-determination, the right of nations and peoples to control their own fate and to decide what form of government they will have. The 14th point called for a general association of nations to be formed, whose members would work together to protect all nations. So Wilson's 14 points here are a really progressive kind of look at world global events. If you remember the context of the time, right? 5/6 of the world controlled by foreign powers. Woodrow Wilson calls for self-determination, these colonial possessions and the people there to form their own governments, which of course would get rid of and overthrow European colonies. And then this idea of this general association, oh my God, I can't talk, general association of nations, right? Or this idea that like the nations of the world should work together and communicate with one another to try to prevent a world conflict from ever happening again, right? In the thick of World War I, people are still incredulous as to the scale of the war and the inability of the political leaders of the world to prevent such a tragic conflict from happening in the first place. So Woodrow Wilson envisioned a team of nations that would talk to each other, work together, and try to settle their problems without tragic war. However, Wilson's 14 points were not embraced by other Allied leaders. However, they kept their feelings private while the war continued because they needed the Americans' help. The 14 points also strengthened the peace movements in Germany and Austria-Hungary, an effect Wilson had hoped for. The 14 points contributed to Germany's decision to surrender in November 1918. The war comes to a close. Russia's withdrawal from the war at the end of 1917 allowed Germany to move troops from the eastern to the western front. With more than 500,000 soldiers now on the western front, German commanders hoped to defeat the British and French forces there and end the war before a large number of Americans could arrive. I think I have a map. Oh, I have a map right here. Let's remember the Western Front is where most of the fighting in Western Europe takes place, is here in France and Belgium. Remember when Germany used the Schlieffen Plan to try to swing into France and invade Paris? That Western Front develops largely in Belgium and then, of course, in France itself. When Russia leaves, Germany can move its troops from the German-Russian conflict in the east and then move those soldiers on to the Western fronts. In late March 1918, the Germans launched a massive attack on the British at the Second Battle of the Somme. For the next 2 months, they slowly pushed the British and French forces back in heavy fighting. By June, the German army was again within artillery range of Paris, which at the time the French people totally freaked out that the Germans would absolutely annihilate the city of Paris. We almost lived in that world, a world where Paris was blown to smithereens. Casualties on both sides were massive. The Germans lost nearly 500,000 men. British and French losses were only slightly fewer. The German army was exhausted, but the Allies were reinforced by 300,000 American troops arriving on the Western Front each month by late spring. In June, some of these troops helped French forces stop the German advance at Château-Thierry. So we get the involvement. Germany gets very close to kind of delivering a death blow to the French, but the Americans show up just in time to turn the tide on the Western Front. I have a picture here, U.S. soldiers or the doughboys. Okay, some kind of the bayonets, these rifles, and then these primitive machine guns. Interesting and new weaponry of the conflict. In July, after stopping yet another German attack at the Second Battle of the Marne, the Allies counterattacked. Fighting separately for the first time, the American army defeated German forces at Saint-Mihiel in September 1918. Then the Americans joined British and French forces to defeat the Germans in the month-long Battle of the Argonne Forest. These defeats pushed the German army back to the border of Germany. Okay, I have a map here. Right here's again the Western fronts and a lot of the famous battles here. Here's Saint-Mihiel. Right here's the U.S. Army. First successful battles here, and then the Germans are eventually pushed back to Germany. The other Central Powers were also collapsing. An army of Serbian, Italian, Greek, French, and British forces overwhelmed Bulgarian troops in the Balkans. Viewing the situation as hopeless, Bulgaria surrendered on September 30th. Meanwhile, British and Arab forces were rapidly advancing from the east and south in the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria's defeat exposed the empire to attack from the west as well. On October 30th, the Turks surrendered. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary, destroyed by the collapse of its army and independence movements within its own empire, also asked for peace. By 1918, the German people were enduring terrible hardships. By late October, those hardships became unbearable as Germans lost confidence that they would be victorious in the end. Mutinies in both the army and navy led to revolts in every major German city. On November 9th, the Kaiser abdicated and then fled to the Netherlands. In Berlin, the monarchy came to an end. Civilian political leaders took control and declared Germany to be a republic. So, the Kaiser is the German king. Kaiser is the German word for Caesar, taken from the ancient Roman Empire. And November 9th, the Kaiser abdicates the throne and the German monarchy ends. So remember, as we've been tracing the end of feudalism, you get constitutional monarchy in Britain, the French Revolution in French, and now the destruction of the German monarchy at the end of World War I. With Germany on the verge of revolution and Allied armies poised to invade, German leaders knew that only surrender could save their nation. On November 11, 1918, they signed an armistice, an agreement to stop fighting. The Allies' terms for the armistice were stiff. Germany had to turn over much of its military equipment to the Allies and return all of its troops to German soil. The Allies prevented Germany from being able to continue to fight, but they would not occupy Germany itself. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, the war to end all wars was finally over. And so you will see that famous quote, on the 11th hour, in the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I ended. The war's costs. The costs to both sides in World War I were staggering. Of the 65 million men who fought in the war, some 8.5 million were killed and another 21 million wounded, many of them crippled for life. Germany and Russia each lost 1.7 million soldiers, followed by Austria-Hungary and France with more than 1.2 million. Great Britain and its empire suffered some 900,000 dead. The war's civilian casualties were impossible to determine. However, the fighting left parts of France, Belgium, and other places in Europe in ruins. The cost of this destruction has been estimated at 37 billion. To this must be added the 200 million cost of fighting the war. Both figures were huge sums for the time. Yeah, $200 billion in 1914 is almost an incomprehensibly large amount of money. The social and economic effects of the loss of millions of lives cannot be calculated. So, right, there's this incalculable idea that when you say, well, you killed millions and millions of people, for each individual life lost, You just don't know what that person would have accomplished and contributed had they existed and not died on the battlefields. Uh, in a number of European nations, an entire generation of young men had been nearly wiped out. So I've given you some of the statistics here. I would just do a couple notes that I think I would pull away from the costs themselves. Is one when they talk about 20 million wounded. Let me go here. Right? The weaponry of World War I was in a way barbaric and was designed to maim people as worst as possible. Specifically, things like barbed wire, and more specifically, things like artillery shells. Right? Artillery shells, when they explode, if they kill you, that is excellent for the purposes of war, but they also do things like blow off legs and limbs uh, and permanently disfigured millions of men for the rest of their lives. Another idea that comes out of World War I is that there is this burgeoning idea called shell shock, where even if men did not have physical wounds, they oftentimes had mental and psychological wounds. Now, in the early 1900s, we didn't have a good scientific understanding of what was going on with these men who couldn't seem to control some of their behavior or couldn't pull themselves out of depressions or funks or their night terrors um, or the kind of general numbness they felt in life. That shell shock we came to know now today as post traumatic stress disorder. It is something that was never really talked about and measured, but because of the tremendous psychological damage of World War I and the idea of like living in trenches and the explosions of artillery and the chance of death at any second, every single waking moment of existence, took a tremendous psychological toll on that generation of young men. I have one kind of final map for you to look at here. You can look through it if you want, the number of deaths from World War I, and I will try to upload a few more resources in Google Classroom. And so we have gone to the end of World War I. We will do the consequences of World War I at the end of our week. Okay, hope you're all staying healthy. Talk to you later.